The officer's voice was ice cold, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered gun as he stared down the black man in the sleek black sedan. "Step out of the vehicle, now," he barked, his tone commanding and sharp. The driver complied, his movements slow and deliberate, his suit pristine and tailored to perfection. Standing tall, the man reached into his pocket, ignoring the officer's sharp intake of breath. The officer's grip on his weapon tightened as he barked, "Keep your hands where I can see them." With calm precision, the driver withdrew a badge and held it up. "I am the head of internal affairs for the state," he said, his voice steady but firm. The officer's face went pale. His eyes darted between the badge and the man holding it. His grip on his gun loosened, but the damage was done. The tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. "Sir, I didn't," the officer stammered, his bravado crumbling. "Save it." The man cut him off, his eyes narrowing. "You've made a big mistake." The officer opened his mouth, perhaps to defend himself, but the man raised a hand. "I'll handle this myself," he said sharply, his tone brooking no argument. The silence between them was deafening, broken only by the faint hiss of passing traffic. Then, as if to hammer home the weight of the moment, the man's phone began to ring, its piercing tone echoing in the stillness. Earlier that day, the sun had barely risen when Martin Campbell, a man known for his dedication to justice, prepared for his morning routine. As the head of internal affairs, he was no stranger to conflicts within law enforcement. His position often put him in the crosshairs of officers who resented his oversight, but Martin had grown a thick skin over the years. He believed in holding people accountable, no matter their rank, no matter their badge. That morning, he sipped his coffee while scanning emails on his laptop. There was an ongoing investigation into complaints of racial profiling by some officers in the department. Though the issue was delicate, Martin was determined to get to the truth. His wife, Linda, entered the room, her cheerful demeanor a stark contrast to Martin's focus. "You're going in early again?" she asked, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Just tying up some loose ends," he replied with a small smile. As he drove to the office, Martin mulled over the reports. The allegations were serious, and he knew the public's trust in the department depended on how thoroughly he handled the case. His mind was so preoccupied with the details that he almost missed the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. Pulling over to the side of the road, he glanced at the dashboard clock. He wasn't speeding, and all his documents were in order. He couldn't think of a reason for the stop. When the officer approached, Martin rolled down his window and offered a polite, "Good morning, officer." "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone clipped and devoid of courtesy. Martin handed over his documents without a word, watching as the officer scanned them with a frown. "You're not from around here, are you?" the officer asked. Martin raised an eyebrow. "I live in the city." The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. "Step out of the vehicle." "Is there a problem?" Martin asked, his tone neutral but firm. "Don't make me ask again," the officer snapped. As Martin exited the car, he could feel the eyes of passing drivers on him. He stood tall, refusing to let the officer's demeanor intimidate him. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," the officer said vaguely. Martin's jaw tightened. He had heard that line before, too many times. "What description?" he asked, his voice calm despite the fire building inside him. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he asked, "What's in your pockets?" Martin slowly reached into his pocket, his movements measured. He pulled out his badge and held it up for the officer to see. The reaction was immediate: shock, fear, and finally, the realization of who he had just stopped. "You made a mistake," Martin said, his voice low but filled with authority. The officer's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. For a moment, Martin thought the man might try to deflect or excuse his actions. But before either of them could speak, the phone in Martin's pocket began to ring. As Martin answered the call, the officer took a cautious step back, his earlier arrogance replaced by uncertainty. Martin's expression darkened as he listened to the voice on the other end of the line. The tension was broken only by the sound of sirens in the distance. Something was happening nearby, and Martin could feel the weight of the moment shifting. He ended the call and turned his gaze back to the officer. "This isn't over," he said, his voice a promise of what was to come. The officer stood frozen as Martin's words lingered in the air. "This isn't over" wasn't just a statement. It was a declaration. The faint wail of approaching sirens made the officer shift uncomfortably, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Martin didn't wait for a response. He stepped back toward his car, phone still in hand, dialing a number with practiced precision. The officer's protest sputtered to life. "Sir, I didn't mean—" "Save it," Martin interrupted, his back turned. "You'll have your chance to explain." As the sirens grew louder, Martin lowered the phone and leaned against the side of his car, his face calm but his posture rigid. The officer glanced nervously down the road, the sound of squad cars fast approaching. 2 patrol vehicles pulled up, their blue and red lights flashing in the morning haze. Officers stepped out, their movements brisk and efficient. They paused when they saw Martin standing there, his suit immaculate and his presence commanding. "Mr. Campbell?" one of them asked, his voice tinged with respect and surprise. "That's right," Martin replied, his voice steady. He gestured toward the officer who had stopped him. "This man decided to pull me over without cause. I'll need his badge number, his name, and a full account of why this happened." The officer's colleagues exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a sergeant by the stripes on his uniform, stepped forward. "Sir, we'll handle this." "Officer Daniels, what's going on here?" Daniels, his name finally spoken aloud, stammered. I thought his vehicle matched the description of—" "Spare me," Martin cut in sharply. "We both know that's not the truth. And we both know why you stopped me." The sergeant gave Daniels a sharp look. "Daniels, step back." "Now." Daniels obeyed, his face red with a mix of anger and embarrassment. "Sergeant," Martin said, his tone measured, "I expect your full cooperation in this investigation. As head of internal affairs, I won't tolerate this kind of behavior in our ranks. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," the sergeant replied, his voice steady but nervous. Martin turned to Daniels. "You're suspended from active duty effective immediately. Leave your badge and firearm with your sergeant." Daniels' eyes widened in shock. "You can't." "Oh, I can," Martin said, stepping closer, his voice dangerously low. "And I will. This is exactly the kind of behavior that gives the department a bad name." Daniels hesitated, then reluctantly removed his badge and holstered firearm, handing them over to the sergeant. His hands trembled slightly, his earlier bravado completely gone. As the other officers dispersed, Martin returned to his car, but his mind was far from at ease. He could have let it end there, but he knew this was bigger than a single officer's actions. Daniels wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. Martin had seen the reports. Cases of racial profiling were piling up, and it was clear there were deeper issues within the department. Martin's phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was Linda. "Hey," he answered, trying to keep his voice calm. "Martin, are you okay?" she asked, her concern evident. "I saw the news about increased police stops in your area. Were you?" "I'm fine," he interrupted, though the weight of the morning's events pressed heavily on him. "Just another day at work." "Be careful," Linda said softly. "You know how things can get." "I will," he promised, ending the call. Later that day, Martin arrived at the office, his presence drawing immediate attention. The staff knew better than to ask questions, but the tension was palpable. Martin's assistant, Claire, approached him with a stack of papers. "These are the latest complaints," she said, her voice quiet. "I thought you'd want to see them right away." Martin flipped through the reports, his jaw tightening. Names, dates, and details of incidents, all pointing to a pattern that couldn't be ignored. "Get me everything we have on Officer Daniels," he said, handing the papers back. "His file, his evaluations, any complaints. I want it all." Claire nodded and hurried off. As Martin sat at his desk, he couldn't shake the feeling that Daniels' actions were just the tip of the iceberg. There was something deeper, something systematic, that needed to be addressed. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Claire again, looking uneasy. "Sir, there's someone here to see you," she said. "Who?" Martin asked. Claire hesitated. "It's Officer Daniels. He says he needs to talk to you." Martin's eyes narrowed. He didn't expect Daniels to show his face so soon, especially not here. He stood and straightened his tie, his mind already calculating the possibilities. "Send him in," he said, his tone neutral. Daniels entered, his expression a mix of defiance and desperation. Martin gestured to the chair across from his desk. "You've got 5 minutes," Martin said, his voice calm but firm. Daniels sat, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "Look," he began, "I know I messed up, but there's more going on here than you think." Martin leaned back in his chair, his eyes locked on Daniels. "Explain." Daniels hesitated, then leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "There are people in the department, people who don't want you digging too deep. They've been watching you." Martin's expression didn't change, but inside, a chill ran through him. "Who?" he asked, his voice steady. Daniels shook his head. "I don't know exactly, but if you keep pushing, you're going to make enemies. Powerful ones." Martin didn't flinch. "Is that a threat?" "No," Daniels said quickly. "It's a warning." Before Martin could respond, there was a loud crash outside his office. Both men turned toward the door as shouts and footsteps filled the hallway. Martin stood, his instincts on high alert, as the door burst open. The door swung open with a thunderous bang, revealing 2 officers in tactical gear, their faces unreadable and their weapons drawn. The sight sent a jolt of adrenaline through Martin, though he kept his composure. "Campbell," one of them barked, his voice sharp. "You're coming with us." Daniels shot up from his chair, his face pale. "What the hell is this?" he stammered, his eyes darting between the officers and Martin. Martin raised a hand, signaling Daniels to stay quiet. "And what's the charge?" he asked calmly, his eyes fixed on the lead officer. "This isn't an arrest," the officer replied, though his tone was anything but reassuring. "We've been ordered to bring you in for questioning." "Higher-ups' orders." Martin's jaw tightened, his mind racing. He knew better than to resist. This wasn't the place or time to make a scene. But the implications of this move were clear. Someone was trying to intimidate him, to send a message. He nodded slowly. "Fine. Let's go." He turned to Daniels, whose face was a mix of fear and guilt. "Stay here. And don't say a word to anyone until I'm back." The officers moved in, their presence overwhelming. As Martin walked between them, he couldn't help but notice how everyone in the office had stopped what they were doing, their eyes wide with shock and disbelief. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The ride to the precinct was silent, the only sound the hum of the car's engine. Martin sat in the back, his hands resting on his lap, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Whoever orchestrated this wanted him rattled. They wanted him to feel powerless. But Martin wasn't one to back down. When they arrived, he was escorted to an interrogation room. Bare walls, a single table, and 2 chairs. He sat down, his posture calm and confident, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him unnerved. Minutes turned into an hour before the door opened. A man in a gray suit walked in, his demeanor smug. Martin recognized him instantly, Deputy Chief Richard Malloy, a man with a reputation for sweeping problems under the rug. "Campbell," Malloy said, sitting across from him, "what an eventful morning you've had." Martin leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Cut to the chase, Malloy. Why am I here?" Malloy chuckled, a hollow sound that grated on Martin's nerves. "You've been stirring up a lot of trouble lately, digging into things that don't concern you." "Racial profiling doesn't concern me?" Martin shot back, his voice steady. "It's my job to ensure this department operates with integrity." Malloy's smile faded. "Watch yourself, Campbell. You're making enemies in high places. People who don't appreciate their authority being questioned." Martin leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "If they're worried, it's because they have something to hide. And I will find it." Malloy's eyes narrowed. "You're playing a dangerous game." "So are they," Martin replied without missing a beat. After another hour of pointless posturing, Martin was released. As he walked out of the precinct, the weight of what had just happened settled on him. This was bigger than he'd anticipated. The corruption ran deeper than a few bad officers. It was systemic, and those at the top were willing to do whatever it took to protect their power. Back at his office, Daniels was waiting, pacing nervously. When Martin walked in, Daniels blurted out, "What happened? Are you okay?" Martin waved him off. "They tried to rattle me. It didn't work." He sat at his desk, his mind already planning his next move. "You said there's more going on here. Start talking." Daniels hesitated, then sat down across from him. "Look, I've heard things, rumors about officers working under the table for private interests. They target specific neighborhoods, make arrests to meet quotas, and even seize assets to line their own pockets." Martin frowned. "And the higher-ups?" Daniels nodded. "They're in on it. Malloy's name comes up a lot, but he's not the only one. This goes way up the chain." Martin's fists clenched. He had suspected corruption, but this was worse than he'd imagined. And if Daniels was telling the truth, the stakes were higher than ever. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Martin pored over files, cross-referencing complaints and reports, looking for patterns. The deeper he dug, the more the pieces began to fit together. The corruption wasn't just about racial profiling. It was about money, power, and control. By the time he left the office, it was late. The city streets quiet under the glow of streetlights. As he walked to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He scanned the shadows, his instincts on high alert. He reached his car and unlocked it, but as he opened the door, he froze. A small, blinking device was taped under the driver's seat. His blood ran cold. Martin's heart pounded as he stared at the blinking device. Years of experience told him this was no ordinary tracker. It was a threat, plain and simple. Whoever had placed it there wanted him to know they were watching, and they were serious. He stepped back, forcing himself to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help. His eyes scanned the area around him, searching for anyone lurking in the shadows or sitting in a parked car. The street appeared empty, but the eerie silence felt too deliberate. Pulling out his phone, Martin dialed a number he had hoped he wouldn't need. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Detective Harris." "It's Martin Campbell," Martin said, his voice low. "I need you at my office parking lot now. Bring the bomb squad." There was a pause, then a sharp intake of breath. "Bomb? I'm not taking any chances," Martin replied. "It's under my car." Harris didn't waste time with questions. "On my way." Martin hung up and stepped farther from the vehicle, keeping his eyes peeled for any sign of danger. He thought about calling Linda but decided against it. The last thing he wanted was to worry her before he knew exactly what he was dealing with. Within 15 minutes, the parking lot was a flurry of activity. Squad cars, an unmarked SUV, and a bomb disposal truck arrived in rapid succession. Officers cordoned off the area, their movements swift and coordinated. Harris, a tall, no-nonsense detective with salt and pepper hair, approached Martin. "You weren't kidding," he said, nodding toward the blinking device visible under the car. "Wish I was," Martin replied. "How bad does it look?" Harris crouched down, examining the device from a safe distance. "Could be a dummy, could be the real thing. Either way, someone's sending a message." "Let's find out who," Martin said, his tone resolute. Harris signaled the bomb squad to move in. They worked with surgical precision, using a robotic arm to carefully dislodge the device and place it into a containment unit. After a tense 20 minutes, the lead technician gave the all-clear. "It's a tracker," the technician confirmed, holding the now-disabled device. Sophisticated but not explosive, relief washed over Martin, but it was short-lived. "Can you trace where it came from?" he asked. The technician shook his head. "Not easily. Whoever made this knew what they were doing. It's going to take time." Harris frowned. "Time isn't something we have a lot of, Campbell." "Tell me about it," Martin muttered. Back at the precinct, Martin and Harris pored over the tracker's details, though it offered few clues. Harris leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "You've clearly rattled someone, Martin. Any idea who?" "Take your pick," Martin replied, his tone bitter. "Malloy, Daniel's so-called higher-ups, or anyone else who doesn't want me digging into the department's dirty laundry." Harris sighed. "You've got your work cut out for you. But you can't fight this alone." "I'm not planning to," Martin said, his eyes narrowing. "But I need proof, something concrete to take them down." Harris hesitated, then leaned forward. There's a safe house we use for witnesses. You can lay low there for a while. Regroup? Martin shook his head. I appreciate it, but I'm not hiding. That's exactly what they want. Then be smart about this, Harris said firmly. Whoever's behind this isn't playing games. The following day, Martin returned to his office to find Claire waiting for him, a thick file in her hands. I pulled everything we have on Daniels and Malloy, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But there's something else. Martin raised an eyebrow. Go on. Claire hesitated, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. There's a meeting tonight. Off the books. High-ranking officers. Malloy will be there. Martin's stomach churned. How do you know this? I overheard one of the secretaries talking, Claire admitted. They didn't think I was paying attention. Where? Martin asked, his tone sharp. Claire hesitated. It's risky, sir. If they find out you're there. Where, Claire? Martin repeated. She sighed and handed him a slip of paper with an address scribbled on it. Just be careful. That evening, Martin parked his car a block away from the address and approached on foot, keeping to the shadows. The building was nondescript, a warehouse with boarded-up windows. A few unmarked cars were parked out front, and a single dim light flickered above the entrance. Martin slipped around to the side, finding a narrow alley with a stack of crates that led up to a second-floor window. It was cracked open, the faint sound of voices filtering through. Carefully, he climbed up and peered inside. What he saw made his blood boil. Malloy stood at the center of a group of officers, gesturing animatedly as he spoke. Campbell's becoming a problem, Malloy said, his voice cold. If he keeps digging, he's going to expose everything. We need to deal with him. Permanently. Martin's breath caught in his throat. The room fell silent as the officers exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a younger man, finally spoke up. What are you suggesting? Malloy smirked. We have ways of handling people like him. Accidents happen all the time. Martin clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay still. He had heard enough. Carefully, he pulled out his phone and began recording the conversation. But then, the crate beneath him shifted. The noise echoed through the alley, and all heads inside the room snapped toward the window. Martin's heart raced as the crate wobbled beneath him, sending a sharp clatter into the stillness of the alley. Inside the warehouse, the voices stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of footsteps. Someone was moving toward the window. He flattened himself against the wall, holding his breath as he heard the window creak open. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the alley. Martin pressed his back into the shadows, every muscle in his body taut. I heard something, a voice muttered from inside. Relax, Malloy replied dismissively. Probably a stray cat. Let's not lose focus. The flashlight withdrew, and the window creaked shut. Martin let out a slow, controlled breath, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He waited until the footsteps receded before carefully lowering himself back to the ground. Martin made his way to his car, his mind racing. The recording on his phone was damning, but it wasn't enough. He needed more, a paper trail, names, dates, something that couldn't be dismissed as hearsay. Back at his office, he transferred the recording to his laptop, replaying it to ensure the audio was clear. Malloy's voice was unmistakable, dripping with malice as he plotted against him. Martin clenched his fists. This wasn't just about corruption anymore. It was personal. They wanted him out of the picture, permanently. Claire knocked on the door, peeking in hesitantly. Sir, are you all right? You've been in here for hours. Martin nodded. I'm fine, but we've got a problem. Malloy's planning something, and it's bigger than I thought. He gestured to the laptop. I've got him on tape, but I need more. Claire stepped inside, closing the door behind her. What do you need me to do? Martin hesitated. He hated putting her in danger, but he couldn't do this alone. Can you access the department's internal records? I need to know who Malloy's been meeting with, who's signed off on his decisions, and where the money's been going. Claire swallowed hard but nodded. I'll see what I can do. The next day, Martin received an anonymous tip through his office line. The caller's voice was disguised, but the message was clear. Stay away from the investigation, or you won't live to regret it. Martin hung up, his jaw tightening. Fear wasn't an option. He had come too far to back down now. But the call confirmed what he already knew. Malloy and his cronies were watching his every move. That evening, Claire returned with a folder of documents. "I had to dig deep for this," she said, her voice low. "Malloy's been approving transfers to a shell company, large sums, completely unaccounted for. And he's not the only one. Daniel's name comes up too." Martin flipped through the papers, his anger growing with each page. The transfers were frequent, the amounts staggering. This wasn't just petty corruption, it was organized crime. Determined to follow the trail, Martin decided to confront Daniels. If he was involved, Martin needed to know how deep it went. He drove to the address listed in Daniels' personnel file, a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. The lights were on, but when Martin knocked, there was no answer. "Daniels," Martin called, knocking harder. Still nothing. He tried the door, and to his surprise, it creaked open. Instincts on high alert, Martin stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound. "Daniels?" he called again, moving cautiously through the living room. Papers were scattered on the floor, the furniture askew. It looked like a struggle had taken place. Martin's stomach sank as he entered the kitchen. Daniels was slumped over the table, his face pale, a gun lying next to his hand. Blood pooled beneath him, staining the floor a dark crimson. Martin's pulse raced as he checked for a pulse. Nothing. Daniels was gone, and the scene told a grim story. It was staged to look like a suicide, but Martin wasn't buying it. Daniels had been silenced, eliminated because he knew too much. He took out his phone and snapped photos of the scene, careful not to touch anything. Then he called Harris. "Harris," he said, his voice tense. "We've got a situation. Daniels is dead." There was a pause. "I'll send a team," Harris said, his voice grim. "Don't touch anything." "I haven't," Martin replied. "But this wasn't a suicide. They killed him." "Understood," Harris said. "Get out of there, Martin. We'll handle it." As Martin left the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His suspicions were confirmed when he noticed a black SUV parked a few houses down. The windows were tinted, and the engine idled quietly. Martin didn't slow his pace, acting as if he hadn't noticed. He got into his car and started the engine, pulling away from the curb. The SUV followed, its headlights glaring in his rearview mirror. He took a series of deliberate turns, testing whether the SUV was tailing him. It was. Whoever was behind the wheel wasn't subtle about it. Martin's mind raced as he navigated the dark streets. He couldn't lead them back to his home or his office. Instead, he headed toward the heart of the city, where the streets were crowded and the lights offered a semblance of safety. As he approached an intersection, Martin spotted an alleyway to his right. Without signaling, he turned sharply, cutting off his headlights as he drove down the narrow path. He parked behind a dumpster, holding his breath as the SUV sped past the alley, its occupants oblivious to his sudden maneuver. Martin waited for several minutes, ensuring the coast was clear before driving away. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his mind racing. Daniels was dead, Malloy was escalating, and now they were actively following him. The noose was tightening, but Martin wasn't about to let them win. Martin parked his car in a secure underground garage far from his usual haunts. He couldn't afford to return home. Whoever was behind this had resources, and it was clear they were watching his every move. As he sat in the car, his phone buzzed, a call from Harris. "Martin," Harris began, his voice tense, "the team's at Daniel's house. It's just like you said, staged to look like a suicide. But there's something else." "What?" Martin asked, his grip tightening on the phone. "We found his laptop," Harris said. "It was hidden in a compartment under his desk. Looks like he was keeping records, names, dates, transactions. I haven't gone through it yet, but it could be the break we need." Martin exhaled, relief washing over him. "Good. Make sure it's secured. If anyone gets wind of this—" "They won't," Harris interrupted. "But you need to be careful. Daniel's death sends a clear message. They're not afraid to kill." "Understood," Martin replied. "Let me know what you find." He ended the call and leaned back in his seat, the weight of the day pressing down on him. Daniels had been trying to do the right thing, and it had cost him his life. Now, it was up to Martin to ensure his sacrifice wasn't in vain. The next morning, Martin met Harris in a secluded cafe. Harris brought the laptop, its exterior scratched and dented, a sign of how hurriedly Daniels must have hidden it. "We've bypassed the password," Harris said, sliding the laptop across the table. "Take a look." Martin opened it, the screen flickering to life. The desktop was cluttered with files, each labeled with cryptic names. Martin clicked on one titled Pipeline _ Ledger and immediately froze. The document was a ledger of payments, huge sums of money routed through a network of shell companies. The names tied to the transactions were chilling: Malloy, several high-ranking officers, and even a few prominent local officials. "This is it," Martin muttered, his voice low. "This is the smoking gun." "There's more," Harris said, pointing to another folder labeled Operation Blueprint. Martin clicked it, revealing a series of scanned documents and emails. They outlined a coordinated effort to target minority neighborhoods, confiscate property, and use the seized assets to fund illegal operations. The plans were meticulously detailed, with Malloy's signature on nearly every page. Martin clenched his fists. They've been profiting off systemic abuse. This isn't just corruption. It's organized exploitation. Harris nodded grimly. "We can't sit on this. But if we go public too soon, they'll bury it and us. We need a plan," Martin said. "We'll take this to the state attorney general, but only when we've gathered enough evidence to make it airtight." As Martin left the cafe, he couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on him again. His instinct screamed at him to check his surroundings, but he forced himself to stay calm, heading to his car at a steady pace. Just as he reached for the door handle, a van screeched to a stop nearby. The side door slid open, and two masked men jumped out, grabbing Martin before he could react. His phone clattered to the ground as they dragged him into the van, the door slamming shut behind them. The van sped through the city, the interior dark and suffocating. Martin struggled against the zip ties binding his wrists, his mind racing. His captors said nothing, their faces hidden behind balaclavas. The hum of the engine and the occasional thud of the tires against potholes were the only sounds. After what felt like an eternity, the van came to an abrupt halt. The door slid open, and Martin was yanked out, his feet stumbling on uneven ground. He squinted against the harsh floodlights illuminating the area. It was a construction site, abandoned, desolate, and the perfect place to make someone disappear. Malloy stepped out from the shadows, his expression smug. "Campbell, always sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Martin straightened, his composure unwavering despite the dire situation. "You're making a mistake, Malloy." Malloy chuckled. "The only mistake I made was underestimating you. But that ends now." He gestured to one of the masked men, who stepped forward, holding a metal pipe. "Let's make this quick," Malloy said. "I have a meeting to get to." The man raised the pipe, and Martin braced himself, his mind racing for a way out. Just as the blow was about to land, the sound of sirens pierced the night air. Malloy's smug expression faltered. "What the?" Blue and red lights lit up the construction site as squad cars surrounded the area. Officers poured out, their weapons drawn. "Drop your weapons," a voice boomed through a megaphone. The masked men hesitated, glancing at Malloy, who cursed under his breath. "Fall back," he barked, but it was too late. The officers moved in, disarming and arresting them one by one. Harris appeared, his gun drawn as he approached Malloy. "It's over, Malloy. You're done." Malloy sneered, but the defeat in his eyes was clear. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Martin stepped forward, his wrists still bound. "Neither do you," he said coldly. Malloy's glare burned with resentment as the officers hauled him toward one of the squad cars. His cryptic words hung in the air. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Martin stood amidst the chaos, wrists still bound, his suit rumpled but his resolve unshaken. Harris approached, cutting through the swarm of officers. "You all right?" Harris asked, pulling out a knife to cut Martin's zip ties. "Physically, yes," Martin replied, rubbing his wrists. "But this isn't over. Malloy isn't bluffing." Whoever's behind him has power, and they won't go down quietly. Harris nodded grimly. We've got him and his goons in custody, and we've secured the evidence from Daniel's laptop. That's a start. A start isn't good enough, Martin said. His voice carried a determination that silenced the noise around them. Malloy's arrest is just the first domino. If we don't act fast, they'll regroup. Harris gestured toward the parked squad cars. Come on, let's debrief at the precinct. There's a lot to sort out. Martin hesitated, glancing at Malloy as he was shoved into the back of a squad car. Their eyes met, and Malloy's lips curled into a smirk. It wasn't the expression of a man who had lost. It was the expression of someone who still held cards up his sleeve. Back at the precinct, Martin and Harris sat in a dimly lit conference room, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. The evidence from Daniel's laptop had been uploaded to a secure server, and a team of analysts was working through it. But the clock was ticking. We've got a clear paper trail linking Malloy to the shell companies and the illegal operations, Harris said, scrolling through the files on his laptop. But there's no direct link to whoever's funding this. It's like Malloy's the middleman. Martin leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Then we need to force his hand. He knows who's pulling the strings, but he won't talk unless he thinks he has no other choice. And how do you plan to do that? Harris asked, raising an eyebrow. Leverage, Martin said simply. Malloy's pride is his weakness. He's too arrogant to believe we can take him down. If we can turn his network against him, he'll crack. Harris frowned. You're talking about going after his lieutenants, the ones who've stayed in the shadows. Exactly, Martin replied. If we can flip just one of them, Malloy's entire operation collapses. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Martin worked tirelessly with Harris and a small, trusted team to identify Malloy's key associates. The names were familiar. Officers with spotless records on paper, but whispers of misconduct trailing them. One name stood out. Captain Aaron Vickers, a man known for his ruthless efficiency and unwavering loyalty to Malloy. He's the linchpin, Martin said during a late-night strategy meeting. If we can get Vickers to talk, we'll have everything we need. Easier said than done, Harris replied. Vickers is as slippery as they come. He won't flip unless he feels cornered. Martin smirked. Then we corner him. The following evening, Martin and Harris executed their plan. Vickers was a creature of habit, always stopping at a small diner after his shift. Martin waited in the parking lot, his heart pounding as he watched Vickers step out of his car and head toward the entrance. Showtime, Harris said through the earpiece. He and a team of officers were positioned nearby, ready to move at a moment's notice. Martin approached Vickers, his footsteps purposeful. Captain Vickers, he called, his voice firm. Vickers turned, his expression shifting from surprise to irritation. Campbell, what do you want? We need to talk, Martin said, stopping a few feet away. And I suggest you listen carefully. Vickers scoffed. I have nothing to say to you. Then listen, Martin said, pulling out his phone. He played a snippet of the recording from the warehouse, Malloy's voice, unmistakable, as he discussed targeting Martin and silencing dissenters. Vickers' face darkened. You're bluffing. Am I? Martin asked, stepping closer. We have enough to bury Malloy. It's only a matter of time before we connect the dots to you. You don't scare me, Vickers said, but his voice wavered. Maybe not, Martin replied. But Malloy? He's going down, and when he does, who do you think he'll throw under the bus? He'll name every accomplice he can to cut a deal. Do you really think you're safe? Vickers hesitated, the cracks in his composure beginning to show. Before he could respond, Harris and the other officers stepped out of the shadows, surrounding him. Captain Vickers, Harris said, his tone formal. We have a warrant for your arrest. Vickers' eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but there was none. Slowly, he raised his hands in surrender. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. I'll talk, but I want immunity. Martin exchanged a glance with Harris. We'll see what we can do, Martin said. But you better give us everything. Back at the precinct, Vickers was placed in an interrogation room, his usual bravado replaced by a nervous energy. Martin and Harris sat across from him, their faces unreadable. You want my cooperation? Vickers began. Then you need to guarantee I'm not going to prison. You're in no position to make demands, Martin said coldly. Start talking. Vickers sighed, running a hand through his hair. Malloy's been working with a group outside the department. Wealthy investors. They funnel money into the shell companies and get a cut of the profits. It's a perfect system, until you came along. Names, Martin demanded. Who are these investors? Vickers hesitated, then leaned forward. You've heard of Senator Gray, right? Martin's eyes widened. Gray was a prominent politician with a spotless public image. If what Vickers was saying was true, the corruption extended far beyond the department. And it's not just Gray, Vickers continued. There are others, businessmen, lawyers, even a judge. They're all in on it. Martin sat back, the enormity of the conspiracy sinking in. This wasn't just a case of corruption. It was a web of power and influence that reached the highest levels. As the interrogation ended, Martin and Harris stepped out of the room, the weight of Vickers' confession heavy on their shoulders. They had the names, but exposing them would be dangerous. These were people with resources, connections, and a lot to lose. We're getting close, Harris said, his voice low. But the closer we get, the more dangerous this becomes. Martin nodded. Then we'll have to be smarter. No mistakes, no leaks. If we're going to take them down, we need to hit them all at once. As they walked down the hallway, Martin's phone buzzed with a message. He glanced at the screen and froze. The message was simple but chilling. Back off, or you'll end up like Daniels. Martin's jaw tightened. The fight was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. Martin's hands gripped the phone tightly, the message burning into his mind. Back off, or you'll end up like Daniels. The threat wasn't a subtle one. Whoever was behind this wanted him to know that they could reach him, no matter where he went or what he did. The implications were clear. He couldn't afford to take one wrong step. He didn't show any outward signs of fear, though. If anything, the threat only fueled his resolve. Daniels had been killed because he had tried to do the right thing. Now it was Martin's turn to finish what Daniels had started. Harris was watching him closely, his expression unreadable. What's the message? Martin exhaled slowly and handed Harris the phone. The detective scanned the text, his face hardening. They're getting desperate, Harris muttered, handing the phone back. They know we're onto them. I don't care what they think, Martin said, his voice low and fierce. I'm not backing down. The following days were a blur of planning, data analysis, and tense meetings. Martin had a list of names now: investors, judges, lawyers, politicians, everyone involved in the vast network of corruption. The more he dug, the more it became clear that this wasn't just about money or power. It was about control. A tight-knit group had been operating under the radar for years, pulling the strings in both law enforcement and politics. Each day, the pressure mounted. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every person a potential spy for Malloy's network. Martin took extra precautions, changing his routines and taking a longer route to and from the precinct. He couldn't afford to be careless, not now. But with each new piece of evidence, he could feel the net closing in on Malloy. The arrested officers, Daniel's former colleagues, had been transferred to different holding cells for their safety, and their testimonies were starting to match Vickers' claims. It was only a matter of time before the full picture came together. Late one evening, as Martin was going over the case files in his office, Claire rushed in, breathless. "Martin, you need to see this," she said, holding up a thick manila envelope. "It's from an anonymous source." Martin didn't hesitate. He reached out and took the envelope, ripping it open. Inside were several pages of documents, many of them stamped with red, confidential marks. His eyes scanned the text, reading quickly. "Looks like someone's trying to clean up their mess," Martin murmured as he flipped through the papers. These are communications between Malloy and several other high-ranking officers. They're planning to cover their tracks, divert funds, delete evidence, and even set up scapegoats to take the fall. Claire frowned. "But why would they send this to us?" "I think they're trying to make sure we don't miss anything," Martin said, his mind already racing through the possibilities. "They're panicking. Someone on the inside doesn't want this to go on any longer." Martin stared at the documents, a mix of satisfaction and unease swirling inside him. This was it, the breakthrough they'd been waiting for. But there was still so much to do. If Malloy caught wind of this, he'd escalate things further. The next few days were a blur of action. Martin worked closely with Harris and the rest of the team, analyzing the new evidence and making preparations to take Malloy and his associates down for good. The trap was set. Everything was in place. But something still gnawed at Martin's gut. He knew Malloy wouldn't go down easily. He was too entrenched, too connected. Then came the final warning. Martin was at his desk, going over the details of the operation, when his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "You're playing a dangerous game, Campbell. There's still time to back off." Martin's eyes hardened as he read the message. There would be no backing off. He'd come too far, sacrificed too much. If they wanted a fight, they would get one. That night, Martin made his move. He called in a team of officers to execute simultaneous raids on several properties connected to the shell companies. The plan was to hit them hard and fast, seizing all evidence and making arrests before anyone had a chance to escape or destroy anything. It was risky. Some of the names on the list were too powerful, too connected. But Martin knew that if they waited any longer, the evidence would vanish. If they acted fast enough, they could take down the entire network in one fell swoop. The night of the raids, Martin stood outside one of the properties, his heart pounding in his chest. His team had already split up, surrounding key locations. The operation was underway, and there was no turning back now. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Martin's phone buzzed again, and he glanced down. A message from Harris. "All units in position. Ready to roll." "Do it," Martin replied, his voice steady. Within minutes, the officers stormed the buildings, breaking down doors and sweeping through rooms with military precision. Martin was in constant communication with Harris, relaying information as they went. The first location was secured quickly. Evidence was seized, and the arrest warrants were executed. But then, just as they were about to move on to the next location, something went wrong. Martin's phone rang, the number marked as restricted. It was Malloy. "Campbell." Malloy's voice came through the line, cool and collected. "You really think you can take us down? You've made a mistake. And now, I'm going to make you pay for it." The line went dead before Martin could respond. His blood ran cold as he realized the truth. Malloy had already made his move. Martin's mind raced as the line went dead. The implications of Malloy's call hit him like a freight train. He had underestimated just how much influence Malloy and his network still had. The operation, which had seemed so foolproof moments before, was suddenly teetering on the brink of disaster. "Something's wrong," Martin muttered to himself, his eyes scanning the documents and files on his desk. He needed to act fast, but the feeling of being several steps behind gnawed at him. The plan had been perfect: raids on multiple properties, simultaneous arrests. But Malloy's warning meant they had already been compromised, and now the network would do everything it could to stop them. He dialed Harris's number with trembling hands. "Harris," Martin said as soon as the detective picked up. "Listen to me. Malloy knows. Something's not right." "Damn it," Harris responded, his voice sharp. "We've already hit 2 locations. We're about to go for the 3rd, but if they know what we're doing..." "They do," Martin cut him off. "Listen, you need to abort the raids. Now, get everyone out of there. They'll be prepared." A moment of silence followed, then Harris's voice, filled with frustration but understanding. "Got it. We'll pull back. But what the hell do you want me to do? If Malloy's got eyes everywhere, we're in trouble." "Get everyone to a secure location," Martin said quickly. "We need to regroup. I'll start making calls." Martin hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation sinking in. Malloy had anticipated their every move, and now they were on the defensive. His mind worked in overdrive as he thought of his next step. Then, a thought hit him. The network. If Malloy had the resources to tip off their operation, he also had the resources to cover his tracks, deleting files, hiding assets, and keeping his collaborators one step ahead. But it wasn't just the officers or the politicians. There was one group Martin hadn't fully considered: the media. Malloy and his associates had plenty of influence over the press. They could control the narrative, shift public perception, and used the media to paint Martin as a rogue investigator, someone working outside the law. If that happened, the public would turn against him, and his credibility would be shattered. Martin had to act quickly before the media spun their version of events. He grabbed his coat and rushed out of the office, knowing his time was running out. As he stepped outside, he spotted a black SUV idling at the curb, its tinted windows concealing the occupants. His stomach tightened as he recognized the make and model. He didn't have to wait for confirmation. It was the same vehicle that had followed him days earlier. Without hesitation, he ducked into an alleyway, hoping to throw them off his trail. But the SUV was right behind him, tailing him down the narrow street. Martin's pulse quickened. He couldn't let them catch him. He knew they wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to silence him. But this time, he wasn't going down without a fight. Martin turned the corner, cutting through an industrial block. He kept his pace steady, his mind racing for a plan. The SUV followed, its headlights cutting through the darkness. It was too late to run. He had no choice but to face them head-on. He reached a small parking lot and ducked behind a row of cars, his breath coming fast as he waited for the SUV to pull into view. He could hear the engine grow closer, but he was ready. As soon as the vehicle came around the corner, Martin sprinted forward, sliding between two parked cars and placing himself directly in front of the SUV. The driver slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. Martin was already moving, grabbing the side mirror and pulling himself up onto the hood. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his gun, aiming it at the windshield. "Stop the car," Martin shouted, his voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through his veins. The driver hesitated for a moment, then slowly rolled down the window, revealing the masked face of one of Malloy's enforcers. "I know who you are," Martin said, his gun still pointed at the driver. "And I know why you're here." The enforcer's lips curled into a sneer. "You don't know anything." Martin's grip tightened on his gun. "Then you'll find out the hard way." Just as he was about to press forward, a siren screamed in the distance. The enforcer's eyes shifted nervously, and without warning, he floored the gas pedal. Martin leapt back, barely avoiding being hit by the speeding vehicle. The SUV roared down the street, disappearing into the night. The sirens grew louder as squad cars arrived on the scene. Martin took a moment to catch his breath, his heart still pounding in his chest. But he knew this wasn't over. Malloy and his network were desperate, and the clock was ticking. He made his way back to his car, fighting the urge to panic. He couldn't afford mistakes, not now. The raids had failed, and he had narrowly escaped an ambush. The stakes were higher than ever. Back at the precinct, Martin gathered Harris and the remaining team members in a secure meeting room. He laid out the latest developments, Malloy's knowledge of their plan, the failed raids, and the close call in the parking lot. "They're on to us," Martin said, his voice tense. "We need to stop them before they strike again." Harris's face was grim. "What's our next move?" Martin didn't hesitate. "We go public. We force their hand. If Malloy wants to play dirty, then we'll make sure everyone knows what he's been doing." The room was quiet for a long moment, the tension thick. "But we need to be careful," Martin added. "Once we go public, we're all targets. We have no idea how deep Malloy's network goes. We need to have everything locked down before we do anything." As Martin left the meeting, his phone buzzed once again. This time, the message was brief, but it sent a cold chill down his spine. "You've made your move. We'll make ours." The message was signed with a simple, cryptic phrase, "The Circle." Martin's grip tightened on the phone. The Circle wasn't just an organization. It was a shadow network that had infiltrated almost every aspect of power. Politicians, judges, law enforcement, and businessmen. It was the hidden hand controlling everything. And now, they were coming for him. The words from the text message still echoed in Martin's mind. The Circle, the shadow organization that had been operating in the background, untouchable and powerful. He had known that the stakes were high, but now, with the full weight of Malloy's connections bearing down on him, the game had changed. He couldn't afford to waste time. Everything had led to this moment. He had gathered enough evidence to bring down Malloy and his network, but if he went public without a fail-proof plan, they would turn everything against him. Martin made his decision. It was time to act before Malloy and his allies had a chance to strike first. The next day, Martin and Harris met in a secure location, a safe house that had been set up just in case things escalated. The atmosphere was tense. Harris didn't say a word, but the look in his eyes showed just how much he understood the gravity of the situation. "Here's the plan," Martin began, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "We take everything we have to the press, every detail, every name. We can't let them silence us. The public needs to know what Malloy and his allies have been doing, and they need to know right now. But we're not doing this alone. We get every bit of media backing we can. If they try to smear us, we'll drown them out. Are you sure about this?" Harris asked, his brow furrowed. "There's no turning back," Martin replied. "But we can't sit on this information anymore. Malloy's people will stop at nothing to destroy us. The only way to beat them is to expose them for who they are." As the press conference was set up, Martin couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settle in his chest. He had prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, the weight of the decision was almost suffocating. He knew that once the truth was out, there would be no going back. But he had made peace with that. The conference room was packed. The cameras flashed as reporters from all over the city gathered to hear the bombshell Martin was about to drop. Harris stood by his side, his expression hard, but there was a flicker of pride in his eyes. Martin stepped up to the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a deep breath, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the sea of journalists in front of him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm but firm. "What I'm about to tell you is not just about one corrupt officer. This goes far deeper. It's about an entire network that has been operating in the shadows, manipulating the system for years. This is about money laundering, bribery, and a conspiracy that reaches into the highest offices in our city. And it all leads back to Deputy Chief Richard Malloy." A gasp rippled through the room. Martin continued, naming names, detailing the evidence, and presenting the documents that would shake the city to its core. As he spoke, he could see the shock on the reporters' faces, the disbelief in their eyes. "We have a list of names," Martin said, his voice unwavering. "The evidence is undeniable. Malloy's network includes politicians, businessmen, law enforcement officers, people who have been using their positions to line their pockets at the expense of the public." The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. He wasn't done yet, though. Malloy and his people have been targeting vulnerable communities for years. They've used their power to steal, manipulate, and destroy lives. This has gone on long enough. It ends now. The press conference sent shockwaves through the city. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, and public opinion quickly turned in Martin's favor. Malloy's allies were on the defensive, trying to discredit the evidence and shift the narrative. But it was too late. The truth had already come out. As the media storm raged on, Malloy was arrested, and Vickers, along with several other key players in the network, was taken into custody. The investigation expanded, reaching into the farthest corners of the city's power structure. With each arrest, the web of corruption unraveled further, and Martin knew that the city would never be the same again. A week later, Martin sat at his desk in the precinct, watching as the last of the perpetrators were brought in. His phone buzzed with a message from Harris. "We did it. Malloy's gone." The circle's falling apart. Martin smiled to himself, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was the smile of a man who had seen the ugly truth of power and corruption and had lived to fight another day. He knew that this battle had been won, but the war for justice was far from over. As he looked out the window, the city stretched out before him, silent, full of people, and yet still so full of secrets. The work wasn't done, but for the first time in a long time, Martin felt the weight lift from his shoulders. He had done the right thing. He had taken down the bad guys, and in the process, he had ensured that the truth would always come to light. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was a new message from an anonymous number. "You think this is over? There's more you don't know. Keep looking." Martin's eyes narrowed as he read the message, but a part of him felt a sense of peace. The fight